also want to ask you, Harsh, about some of your recent initiatives, and particularly about your second Substack, which is called Dharmatva. Yeah. And the themes you're exploring in that, they're very fascinating. Can you tell us more about it? And in your view also, if you could tell us why Dharma is so important for India and also the world.
See, that's the first thing that I must mention is that I'm by no ways a trained religious scholar. I don't even know Sanskrit beyond a very introductory level. But nonetheless, we are an Indian citizen and adult who tries to make sense of what India means, what our lives means, what is the purpose of our lives, and what does it mean to be a Hindu, which I see as a subset of Dharma, capital D Dharma. And therefore, it is important for us to engage at a popular, educated layperson level and revise our own thoughts. Like I've already changed my own views on many topics multiple times. If you've been reading and writing for 10, 15 years, that happens. So what is Dharmatva? I was very conscious about the fact that, there are people are talking about dismantling global Hindutva, which happened in the last few months, right? So I own the term Hindutva. I think around 10 years ago, I would have said, for example, not that it is relevant, but I've always been BJP supporting. Right. That's been my bias. I've never been a member of the party. But even when I was always supporting the BJP, I was like, well, let us do these things like Uniform Civil Code and remove Article 370 and claim the Ram Mandir on a historical ownership basis. Mm-hmm. But I've been for quote unquote genuine secularism, which is interesting separation of state and religion. And we can discuss that later on. And to that extent, when I saw Hindutva as being anti-secular, which I no longer do, I was like, well, maybe Hindutva is not the right word. But then I changed my views over the last 10 years because I realized that people who call themselves anti-Hindutva are basically anti-Hinduism. Okay. That any Hindu assertion on any reasonable level is understood by them to be prima facie in and of itself malified. Right. That it is something that is just not, to use a non-Hindu word, it's not kosher, it's not halal. Right. And so I changed my views in Hindutva, but I also thought often that, a Hindu word itself is a Persian word. It comes from the river Sindhu. It is a geographical word. And we call Dharma to be Sanatana Dharma, right? Yes. Dharma, which means it's timeless. It's for all situations. Yeah. It's interesting that 100 years ago, actually, Sanatani had an orthodox connotation, actually. Right. Sanatanis then were those who would defend what they saw as timeless, which was, a very kind of birth-based, lineage-based Varna system, and women having certain duties, men having certain duties. But the way we kind of see it, and this is broader than Neo-Vedanta, right. Sanatana Dharma now I see it in a Sri Aurobindo sense. Right, and Sri Aurobindo famously said in his Uttar Para speech that actually he said that he also came to the realization that nationalism is actually to that extent a subset of Sanatana Dharma. Right. And he said, I give you today that what is nationalism? It is Sanatana Dharma, and that as Sanatana Dharma expands, India expands. As it shrinks, India shrinks. And interestingly, he said, if it were capable of being destroyed, he did not agree that it can be destroyed. But he said, if it were capable of being destroyed, India would be destroyed. Right. So, if you want to then think of it in a timeless sense, what is it exactly that makes us, and people who we see as not in consonance with Dharma, them? Yes. Right? What is it that separates us? Because then you're talking at the level of superstructure, not any subset of rituals or beliefs or texts, which are all very important at that subset level. Yes. So I came to the conclusion that the real difference is when we talk of moksha, or we talk of any kind of thing that is important for us spiritually, right. We are saying always that it is important for me. Yes. It does not cross our mind that if somebody else does not do it, he or she is destined to burn in hellfire for eternity. Right. I think that extra thing which is added by especially the two proselytizing Abrahamic monotheisms, is what is very unique in world history. It is what is known as the Mosaic Distinction, based on a European scholar's view, Jan Assmann, and he basically said, it initially started with Judaism, although Judaism little evolved, where Judaism was very much seen as always deliberately crafted in opposition partially to Egyptian polytheism and polytheism in that region. And polytheism itself has a problematic, because I'm a polytheist, but some people interpret it differently. There is a better term called henotheism, whereby you can believe in multiple gods, but there may be an underlying same reality. But monotheism, everybody understands, is not just one God, but one exclusive God, or one exclusive truth, or one exclusive prophet and way of doing things, or at least a final prophet and way of doing things. So in that sense, a capital D dharma, not small d many dharmas, which might be very, very different dharmas, a capital D dharma, or the essence of that dharma, and therefore the dharmatva, the tattva of that dharma, is in that sense a negative definition.
Right.
In that sense, that so long as there is mutual respect and not just toleration, and many people have spoken about this, that is basically the essence, that you are non-violent in a non-initiating sense, that you are okay for violence in a way of defending, but you would never initiate violence, and you are for mutual respect. That to me are the very basic common denominators, the building blocks of the superstructure of dharma. This is, of course, not something, this is not useful at all from my day-to-day ritual perspective. It does not tell me if I have to wake up and say, Om Ganapati Namo Namaha, or, should I worship Shivji, or should I worship Ram, or should I not worship anybody, or what day should I fast or not. This is not interested at that level. Interestingly, it is analogous to Hindutva, which was almost to the year crafted 100 years ago by Veer Savarkar, who also said that, this is, he said it's different. I think it's broadly the same as Hinduism, but he basically said Hindutva is not interested in the ritual, theological aspects of different schools, of different panths, of different sampradayas, or different schools of thought, of different, like whether it's Dvaita, Advaita, Vishishta Dvaita. Hindutva is basically the political recognition of the other. Not because you want to create hatred, but because you've already been deemed to be the other by somebody else. And therefore that Purva Paksha, that, okay, I have been deemed to be an other. My natural instinct is never to see anybody else as the other. My natural impulse is in that theological sense, that the word itself, all these words are problematic in a translation sense, but my natural instinct in a theological sense, maybe not in a sociological sense, in a theological sense, it is universalistic.
Absolutely.
Sociological sense is more to do with economics and political structure. So Hindutva basically says you are a Hindu because, and the issue is he had to obviously make it relevant for those times. So therefore he said it, Punya Bhumi, but also Pitra Bhumi. Now, that is a very good enough approximate definition, and therefore very good enough in a revolutionary sense. But what about Zoroastrians? What about potentially somebody who's doing an African polytheistic puja, like a voodoo? Funnily enough, we make fun of that in our everyday language. We don't even realize that. What about a Native American worshipper? The idea behind Savarkar was that there are people, because the way monotheism is a closed corporation, proselytizing, that they have divided loyalties. It's a controversial thesis. It may be less applicable for one religion than the other based on its phase of evolution. But the partition of India partially at least proved it right? Maybe not completely, partially proved it right. But so in that sense, Hindutva was, let us understand that while we have all kinds of identities within that, of language, of caste in a jati sense, but not necessarily in a varna birth sense, of region, of gender and sex, of philosophy, of how we think in terms of Dvaita, of whether we are quote unquote atheist or not. That also is a very problematic translation in Hindi or Sanskrit. So he said, no, the overall rubric is Hindutva. So I think it's very important because there is right now a very faint, it's very, very faint revival of pre-Abrahamic religions and gods and cultures across the world, but especially in the West, because they have actually had freedom of speech and secularism, broadly speaking, for, if not centuries, at least decades. And after the 1960s, the sexual revolution happened there. The Catholic Church was forced to become, quote unquote, relativistic in the sense it said, okay, maybe outside of the church, there could be some salvation. There could be, the Jews may not actually burn in hellfire forever, partially because of the Holocaust guilt, partially because of changing culture. And there are many Catholic trads who oppose it internally, but they've not been successful at the papal level yet fully. Although the overall position is still very orthodox and not in any way dharmic. But so my point is, there are neo-pagan revivals of pre-Christian religions in Germany, in Greece. In fact, a lot of American architecture historically, if you look at Abraham Lincoln's statue in DC, it's a copy of the Zeus statue in parts of Greece. Like the Apollo space mission is named after a Greek god. Poseidon or Neptune, the days of the week, the months, the stars and planets. So much of it is, of course, because of Western and European domination and Eurocentrism. Nonetheless, they kept it not after Catholic or Catholic saints or Protestant figures. They kept it after Greco-Roman gods. And my point is, we don't have to say to those people that you must worship Ram, or you must even use the word Dharmatva.
Yes.
But it must be India's civilizational responsibility to, behind the scenes, in a very humble manner, facilitate those resurgences. Ram Swarup wrote about this. I think indirectly Girilal Jain also kind of was hinting at it. And sometimes it will have to be done with a lot of humility. Sometimes, because ultimately these are matters of faith. You can't force it. You might make one temple with all different deities, but it can only be one temple.
Yes.
It has to be done locally. And I bring in the concept of the Panchayat and Puja from the Smarta kind of tradition. And the idea is you have multiple gods, but you choose to prioritize one god. Right? In the Panchayat and Puja, historically, there are 5 gods, and your personal favorite, so to speak, your Ishta Devta could be at the center. The other ones could be in the 4 corners, maybe a Kul Devta, maybe a Gram Devta. And there are also historically some common accepted manifestations. There is one may be Shiva, one may be Shakti, there's a female form, there's some Vaishnav form. There is generally some worship of some animal, which is often represented by Ganeshji, and nature, Surya Devta. So it's a beautiful concept where all of nature is represented and all forms of humanity, forces of nature are represented. So why not think in terms of, as these Europeans or Africans or Native Americans or East Asians or Middle Easterns. Remember, the satanic verses are about the daughters of Allah. Right. So there are female goddesses. Yes. There are 360 odd deities that were destroyed when Mecca was conquered. So there are these gods and goddesses. If somebody revives them, why not be a very silent, humble facilitator of that? It may take 50, 100 years. It may never fully happen. But there is absolutely no downside to us, and every possible upside from an angle of peace, prosperity, and pluralism. Because what happened is, when some concepts of interest in these religions revived 100 years ago, their initial focus was on nationalism. Yes. Remember, in the narrow European nationalism sense, not in the Indian sense, as if I am in Lithuania and these are Lithuanian gods, right, which is fine. But what happened was they also tended to therefore exclude non-Lithuanians. And sometimes deliberately or otherwise, they became handmaidens to some kind of neo-fascist movement. And even when they were not, enemies of polytheism tried to label them as handmaidens of fascism. Even today, Hitler is often linked to Hindutva in a very strange sort of manner. The most classical example being obviously the swastika, which has a completely different history. So, but my point is, okay, now we have a much more different multicultural West. You revive the Lithuanian religion, you worship multiple gods, and the central gods will remain Lithuanian, but maybe one of the gods can be Spanish. And that connection, that pantheons, interconnected pantheons, which obviously will also include some Indian/Hindu gods, I think will make it a very different world, because we already have, this is a very different way of approaching Eastern versus Abrahamic religions, right? We have holy festivals. Like I've been to music festivals in the UK, in places like Milton Keynes, which, if you were not aware, it looked like holy festivals. Of course, it was actually a music festival. So why not have that spirit of lightness, spirit of worship, seriousness as well as lightness, organically through research, whereby those, for example, all of Africa has been divided in roughly between a northern Islamic half and a southern Christian half. People don't know that sub-Saharan Southern Africa was basically Christianized within the last 100 years.
Right.
So why not bring back, in a very humble manner, the research, the theogony, how the gods descended? Why don't you document that? Isn't that what, in a way, our religion has done, right? With all our sacred texts, we have these ideas of the god. This god is the brother of that god and was married to that goddess, etc. So this is something very important, because people always consider their ancient past to be something deeply connected to them in an emotional manner.
Yes.
Even Egypt right now is trying to revive, obviously partially for tourist reasons. Yeah. Partially it's a military dictatorship which is very afraid of the Muslim Brotherhood, but it is trying to revive the Egyptian polytheist paganism. I don't like the word paganism in that sense. I like the word polytheism more, but it may work, it may not work. In fact, under Raza Pahlavi, the pre-Iranian Islamic revolution, they also tried to bring back the pre-Islamic past of Iran. It kind of washed away with the Islamic revolution, but it never fully goes away. The Shahnama is actually a documentation of pre-Islamic kings, ironically written by Ferdowsi and subsidized by Mahmud Ghazni, who actually did a lot of iconoclasm in India. But that memory of Shahnama was partially relevant in making Iran Shiite, between the Mughal Empire and the Ottoman Empire, because that sense of national identity in a subterranean sense always remained. So, the world will never be fully homogenized.
Yes.
The only universalism that will work is a non-homogenizing universalism.
Yes.
And that kind of spirituality or religion, if you want to use that word, has to be cosmopolitan. So it is very important for India, as we get richer and more powerful, to A, remain humble, but B, try to help from the background to revive these movements at the government level, at a private sector level, at a non-profit level, at a research level, so that, because ultimately for us, it's not so important what god or goddess you're worshipping. The fact that we are part of that kind of polytheistic, pluralistic panchayatana framework is important, because we instinctually understand that I'm not trying to judge you for the god you're worshipping, because that's not how a non-Abrahamic mind just thinks, whether it is shamanic or it's Buddhist or it's Vedic or it's Greco-Roman or it's, to some extent Zoroastrian. There are nuances, there are differences. So I think it's important that, when we say what is India's worldview, okay, if you become a Hindu Rashtra of sorts, which in a way we already are, okay, what next? What is the global vision? Parts of it have to be geopolitical and economic, but what is the spiritual? When you say you're a Vishwa Guru, I say, well, more important, first be a Vishwa Shishya, right? Because you first focus on what is it that, because, why did Cassius Clay become Muhammad Ali in the US in the 1950s or 60s or whenever he became? Because of self-respect. And because he saw that becoming Muslim in white Christian America, was his form of showing a middle finger to the discrimination all around him. Yeah. It is unfortunate if India or dharmic or dharmatva kind of sensibilities were more prevalent, and if African native traditions were kind of more available on a plate for somebody who is clearly looking for that identity, then he or she might have gone directly for that.
Yes.
For him or for Malcolm X, who went for Nation of Islam, it wasn't for Islam per se, it was to oppose the white Christian dominance of America. So what could be more authentic than what their own ancestors worshipped? Even though the Reconstructionism may never happen in the same way, it might be slightly different. So whenever somebody says Black Lives Matter, I said, yes, absolutely, but Black faiths matter as well, because that is their souls. So I take that example because the Greco-Roman example is more well-known. The Native American example is known, but imagine Africa is going to have a huge population by the end of the century, even if some of the estimates are perhaps exaggerated. And what is our worldview about that? We don't want them to worship Ram or Krishna necessarily. Of course, if somebody does that through ISKCON or somebody else, that's fine. But if they are peaceful, prosperous, and worshiping their own gods and goddesses, and occasionally mixing and matching, because that's how gods have always spread, but organically, never in a forced manner, then it is completely in our civilization interest, because that is how the Indian civilization becomes the universal human civilization, but never by homogenizing. So I hope you get a sense of where I'm trying to come from when I think of Dharmatva. So this is very much something that will happen over decades, because this is not something that will happen over the short term. But I think it is important to start thinking of what we want to achieve if and when we become more powerful and prosperous, as I think we will.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.